The one news that missed everyone in the otherwise very happening news cycle was that of the GDP numbers that came out of China very recently for the third quarter of. Now, pre-COVID and post-COVID GDP situations are very different across the world. We'll come to the numbers in a bit. Now, the origins of COVID-19, the coronavirus outbreak, it was in Wuhan, it was in China. And now it seems almost like a lifetime ago that when Wuhan was on a complete lockdown for over 2 months. Now, what are the third quarter GDP numbers for China like? Well, for one, China has seen a growth of 4.9% in the third quarter, which is up from 3.2% it witnessed in the second quarter of the calendar year of 2020. In the first quarter, which also included the Wuhan lockdown, the GDP growth for China was minus 6.8%. It saw a contraction from minus 6.8%. But here's where it becomes interesting. Now, we'll talk a lot of numbers here, that how China has actually braved COVID-19 and emerged as a winner, which is, I think, one of the biggest ironies in contemporary history. But here's take a look at what the International Monetary Fund had for projections. For the world economy, the IMF has predicted a contraction of minus 4.4%, rather a contraction of 4.4%. For US, the contraction is 4.3%, while for the European zone, it's a contraction of 8.3%. What happens to China then? China, according to the IMF, is going to see a growth of 1.9%. Another irony. Now, if I talk about the sales number, if I talk about the exports, it has been a great overseas market in that sense. If I go by year-on-year changes, the Chinese market has only contracted by 1.1%, whereas Japan and the United States have contracted by 12.7% and 10.7% respectively. So even as an overseas market for exports for different countries, China has emerged as a winner. And this is why countries would be looking to China to rescue them from the ongoing global recession, as it did in 2008 with those major stimuluses that were ushered. But that's a discussion for a separate day. If we talk about the retail sales in China for September on an year-on-year basis, it's grown by 3.3%. And more or less, the 4.9% growth, which has been witnessed in the third quarter, it puts China back on the trajectory of 5.5 to 6% growth they want to see for their economy. Now, why are these numbers important? Go back to March, go back to February, go back to perhaps January 2020. The world's attention was on China's GDP. The Chinese had been seeing a lowest GDP growth in 30 years. They were seeing probably very bad GDP numbers, which was becoming very difficult to explain domestically for Xi Jinping. What's happened 9 months later is a fairy tale story coming true for Xi Jinping. The coronavirus has actually been a blessing in disguise, or perhaps if they created themselves in a very spectacular plan, if I may call it that way, for China, because every other economy of the world has gone into a contraction, but the Chinese have shown an appreciation, a growth of 4.9% for this quarter, and some are now predicting a growth of close to 6% in the final quarter of 2020. Now, this brings us to a second aspect I want to discuss. What has the second quarter growth been like across the world? While for China, the growth was 3.2%, here's what the major economies were doing in the second quarter of 2020. South Korea saw a contraction of 3%. For US, the contraction was 9.5%. Japan, 10% contraction. Germany, 11.7% contraction. The G7 had a collective contraction of 12.1%. The European Union had a contraction of 14.1%. And the United Kingdom had a contraction of 21.7%. India alone had a contraction of more than 22% rather. So while China was growing at a rate of 3.2% in the second quarter of 2020, the other countries were witnessing gigantic contractions. And this again shows how China has emerged as a winner from COVID-19. Now, what has COVID-19, what has this GDP growth really done for China? It has done a number of things, if I may go point by point. Firstly, it's a validation for the dictatorial procedures, the lockdowns, the kind of Wuhan lockdown, which was unhuman almost, as some of the videos surfaced in those times told us. Till date, we do not have the clear numbers of total COVID cases or deaths from China. But somehow the GDP, which is in the green right now, it's sort of a validation for China's dictatorial practices, and they're only going to get worse in the future. I'll come to that in a bit. It's also been an opportunity for China to stock up on very cheap oil. Now, if you remember, the Brent crude and the WTI, they were almost in a very bad position. One of them had also gone in the negative. Some crude oil benchmarks were always in the negative for weeks and weeks before the market came into the green. China saw that as an opportunity to stock up on free oil, and now once the demand goes back to normal, they will be making use of the cheap oil they have stocked and perhaps importing more. For all in all, it has been a great opportunity for China to stock up on cheap oil. Another thing has been Hong Kong. Now remember, this time last year, we were talking about the Hong Kong protests. We were talking about the problems that Hong Kong citizens were facing. We were talking about the one country, two systems, and we were talking about so much with respect to Hong Kong. We were seeing protests every day. Airports were shut down. What has happened 1 year later? The protests are unheard of. A national security law has taken place in Hong Kong, which is so disastrous, as I might say, or more so dictatorial, that tonight, if I am criticizing the law of the national security law of Hong Kong, the Chinese have the right to arrest me if I ever walk into any territory where Chinese have an influence. So 1 year later, not only have the Chinese suppressed Hong Kong, they have also inculcated it better within the mainland way of governance, within the Chinese way of governance. The democracy from Hong Kong is gone. This is where China gained again. The medical exports, the masks. Now, one would say that the exports from China, which are largely driven by medical equipments and accessories, and also from a number of work from home accessories, they might not be very sustainable. But for now, the Chinese have powered their factories. They're producing masks, they're producing ventilators, they're producing a lot of work from home equipment. If you remember, even when Trump was criticizing the Chinese for creating this virus, for unleashing this virus, the Chinese were actually making ventilators for New York, which was then seeing a peak of coronavirus outbreak. So this gets to show that the Chinese have actually utilized the COVID-19 situation to their benefit, powered their factories, given all the stimulus that was needed to the manufacturers, created ventilators, exported them to Europe, South America, North America. Perhaps only this can explain the irony that the President of the United States, while depending on ventilators that were coming from New York, was criticizing China for COVID-19. And lastly, it has now given China a greater influence in the UN. The US has walked out of the WHO, it has walked out of the United Nations Human Rights Council and a number of other organizations. But more or less, this gives China a greater influence in the United Nations. Even the Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, he spoke of a greater and a changed role for the United Nations because the same role cannot go on. But for now, China has gained great prominence within the United Nations as the US has by its will, pushed itself behind. It's taken a step back from the United Nations. This has been a great achievement for China from COVID-19. So what's next for China? They have done all things right. So what are they really up to now? The other big news of the week was China planning a very large-scale test of its digital currency. Now, I did a very, very elaborate video on the hows and whys of digital currency with Karan. That was earlier this year. I'll put a link in the description for you all to see. And you must to understand digital currency. But here's what China did in its Silicon Valley, in the Shenzhen province. It had a lottery where almost 2 million people participated, 50,000 were the lucky winners, and it gave out 200 yuan each, or a total of 10 million yuan to 50,000 people, 200 yuan each, or almost $1.5 million. Now, this digital yuan, which is a digital currency, it's not a paper currency, it was to be spent at 3,000 retail outlets as a test for China's digital currency. Now, why is this important? Because at this moment, 80% of the central bankers, they're talking about digital currency. They're talking about the rollout of the digital currency. But China is leaps and bounds ahead, and it's already planning a rollout of the digital currency ahead of the 2022 Winter Olympics that are scheduled to happen in China. Now, what happens with the digital currency rollout? Well, for one, it brings the government closer to the consumers because the commercial banks in between, the likes of Alibaba Pay and WeChat Pay, they'll still be there. Of course, they'll be complementing the payment structure. But it gives China a greater access into understanding how, where, and when the people are spending. To put it simply, it gives them more surveillance power. It gives them surveillance power over the financial decisions that are made by the people. And that could be a disaster, perhaps, for a country like China. But then again, already they are under strict surveillance, and COVID-19 was a validation for those surveillance. But all in all, it comes across as an irony, but China was expected to collapse post-COVID-19. But all in all, it has emerged as a winner, at least as the recent GDP number shows. As the economies across the world fight contractions, they are fighting or figuring out ways to come out of this artificial recession, as I would like to call it. China is already surging ahead and is expected to better in the next quarter. What is this if not the biggest of all ironies we've heard in recent history? Thank you.